Welcome back to another video. First off, I'd love to know where you are listening from. Let me know in the comments. Also, feel free to request a story you'd like me to cover in future videos. Before we start, can we hit 300 likes on this video? It really helps the channel. It all started when I decided to clean out my phone. I had hundreds, maybe even thousands, of photos cluttering up my storage, random snapshots from vacations, nights out with friends, and the mundane moments of life. Most of them were unremarkable, the kind of photos you keep but never really look at again. As I scrolled through my gallery, I started deleting the blurry pictures, duplicates, and old screenshots. It was late at night, and the task was mindless, almost soothing. I was halfway through my vacation photos when something caught my eye. A face. I stopped scrolling, my thumb hovering over the screen as I stared at the image. It was a picture I had taken a few weeks ago during a hiking trip with friends. We were on a trail in the mountains, surrounded by trees, the sun setting in the background. The picture showed me and my friends smiling, posing with the beautiful view behind us. But there, in the background, barely visible between the trees, was a man. He was standing off to the side, partially obscured by the shadows of the forest. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, and his eyes were staring directly at the camera. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't remember anyone being there when I took the picture. It had just been me and my friends on that trail. The area had been deserted, far from the usual tourist spots. There shouldn't have been anyone else around. I zoomed in on the photo, trying to get a better look at the man. His features were blurry, distorted by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the fact that he was staring straight at the camera, straight at me. A wave of unease washed over me as I scrolled through the rest of the photos from that day. None of the other pictures showed the man. He was only in that one image, standing in the background, watching us. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just another hiker passing by, someone I hadn't noticed at the time. But something about his presence felt wrong, unnatural. The way he was standing there, so still, so silent, made my skin crawl. I put my phone down, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But as the night wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the photo. His pale face, his staring eyes, it haunted me. The next day, I showed the picture to my friends, hoping they might remember seeing him. But none of them did. They all insisted that we had been alone on the trail, that no one else had been around. Maybe it's just someone in the background you didn't notice, one of my friends suggested. But her voice wavered, and I could tell she was just as unsettled as I was. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about the photo. But every time I opened my phone, it was there, lurking in my gallery, a constant reminder of the man who shouldn't have been there. I thought about deleting it, but something stopped me. It was as if I needed to keep it, to understand what was happening. Then, a few nights later, I took another look at the photo and noticed something that made my blood run cold. The man had moved. He wasn't standing in the same spot anymore. In the original picture, he had been partially hidden by the trees, his face barely visible. But now, he was standing closer to the foreground, his face clearer, his eyes even more intense. I stared at the image, my heart pounding in my chest. How was this possible? Photos don't change. People don't move after the picture's been taken. I frantically scrolled through the rest of my gallery, my fingers trembling. The other photos from that day hadn't changed. It was just this one, the one with the man. And now he was closer, watching. I turned off my phone, my mind racing. It couldn't be real. There had to be some kind of explanation. Maybe the photo had glitched, or maybe I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The man in the photo wasn't just a coincidence. He wasn't supposed to be there. The next morning, I took my phone to a tech expert, hoping they could explain what was happening. I showed them the photo, explaining how the man had moved, how his position had changed. But when they looked at the image, they shook their head. "There's no way this could happen," the tech said, frowning. "Photos don't just change like that. It's probably just a trick of the light, or maybe your memory is playing tricks on you." I knew they were wrong. I knew what I had seen. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of the man, his face getting closer, his eyes boring into mine, was burned into my mind. I kept my phone on the nightstand, the screen turned off, but I could feel its presence like a weight in the room. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a buzzing sound. I reached for my phone, thinking it was a notification. But when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. It was the photo. The image had opened on its own, the man now closer than ever. His face filled the screen, his eyes wide and lifeless, his expression blank. I dropped the phone, my heart racing as I backed away from the nightstand. Then the screen flickered, and the man smiled. It was the most unnatural, horrifying smile I had ever seen. His lips stretched too wide, his teeth unnervingly white, his eyes still locked on mine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at the screen in terror as the man's smile grew wider, more menacing. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the screen went dark. I sat there in the darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body frozen with fear. I didn't dare touch the phone. I didn't dare look at the screen again. The next morning, I deleted the photo. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought that deleting the image would get rid of the man, erase him from my life. But I was wrong. A few days later, as I was going through my phone, I found a new photo in my gallery. It was a picture of my bedroom. I hadn't taken it. The photo was taken from the corner of the room, near the window. The angle was strange, almost as if someone had been standing there, watching me. And there, in the photo, was my bed. The covers were rumpled, and my phone was lying on the nightstand. But that wasn't the worst part. Standing in the corner, partially hidden by the shadows, was the man. His eyes were wide, his expression blank, his body still as a statue. He was watching me, just like he had been in the first photo. But this time he wasn't in the background. This time he was in my room. I stared at the image, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I hadn't taken this picture. I hadn't even been in the room when it was taken. But there he was standing there, watching, waiting. I deleted the photo immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. But I knew it wasn't over. That night I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing again. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me. But I had no choice. I reached for the phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. There was a new photo in my gallery. It was a picture of me, sleeping. And there, in the background, standing by the foot of my bed, was the man. It was the kind of discovery that you don't expect to make in your own home, a hidden room behind the walls, forgotten and untouched for years. My house wasn't particularly old or grand, just a modest two-story place that I had bought a few years ago. I had always liked the house, but now it felt different. Now it felt like it was hiding something from me. It all started when I decided to renovate the basement. The space had been mostly unused since I moved in just a storage area filled with old boxes and forgotten furniture. I had big plans for it, though a game room, maybe a small home gym. But as I began to clear out the clutter, I noticed something strange. There was a section of the wall that didn't quite match the rest of the basement. It looked newer, as if it had been patched up more recently than the other walls. At first, I thought it was just a repair job, maybe a fix from a previous owner, but the more I looked at it, the more curious I became. Why would someone patch up part of the wall when the rest of the basement was clearly older, untouched? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a hammer and started tapping on the wall. The sound was hollow, unlike the solid thud I had expected. I tapped again, harder this time, and the plaster crumbled slightly, revealing what looked like a wooden door behind it. A hidden door. My heart raced. I had lived in the house for years and had no idea this was here. I couldn't believe it. I carefully chipped away at the plaster, revealing more of the door. It was small, barely tall enough for an adult to walk through without ducking, and the wood was old, cracked in places but still sturdy. There was no handle, just a keyhole. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my mind racing with questions. Why had this room been sealed off? What was inside? Part of me didn't want to find out, but I knew I couldn't leave it alone. I needed to know what was behind that door. I went upstairs to grab a flashlight and a crowbar, determined to pry the door open. When I returned to the basement, I noticed something strange. The air was colder, and the basement felt different, as if the very atmosphere had changed since I discovered the door. With a deep breath, I jammed the crowbar into the crack between the door and the frame, pushing with all my strength. The wood groaned in protest, but after a few minutes, the door gave way, swinging open with a creak. A gust of cold, musty air rushed out, and I instinctively covered my nose, the smell of damp wood and mildew filling the air. I shined the flashlight into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was small, just big enough for a few pieces of furniture. It was empty except for an old, worn chair sitting in the center and a shelf on the far wall. The walls were made of rough stone, the kind you'd expect to find in a much older building, not in a house like mine. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The air was thick and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. I moved the flashlight around the room, my pulse quickening as I took in the eerie sight. That's when I noticed the writing. It was faint, barely visible in the dim light, but there on the wall opposite the door were words scrawled in what looked like charcoal. The writing was erratic, the letters uneven, as if they had been drawn in a hurry. I moved closer, shining the flashlight over the words, and my blood ran cold as I read them. Don't let it out, Dot. A chill ran down my spine. What did that mean? What was it? I looked around the room again, my heart racing, but there was nothing there, just the chair and the shelf. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something unseen, lurking in the shadows of the hidden room. I moved closer to the shelf, my hands trembling as I shined the flashlight over it. It was covered in dust, the wood warped and rotting in places. There were a few old, faded books sitting on it, their covers worn and cracked. I reached out, my fingers brushing against one of the books, when I heard it. A soft, scratching sound. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, like nails dragging across wood. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight toward the source of the noise, but the room was empty. The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get out. The sound was coming from the walls. I backed away, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, echoing through the small room. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, like something was trapped behind the stone. I turned and bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I didn't know what I had just heard, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going back into that room. I tried to forget about it, to pretend that the room didn't exist, but the memory of the scratching haunted me. Every time I went into the basement, I could feel it an unease, a presence that I couldn't explain. The air down there felt colder, heavier, as if the room was waiting for something. And then, one night, the nightmares began. I dreamed of the room. I dreamed of the chair, the shelf, the writing on the wall. But in the dream, the room wasn't empty. There was something sitting in the chair, something shrouded in shadow, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, feel the weight of its gaze. In the dream, the scratching was louder, more intense, as if whatever was behind the walls was trying to break free. And every time, just as the door creaked open, I would wake up, my heart pounding, drenched in sweat. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong, that I had unleashed something the moment I opened that door. A few days later, I went back into the basement, determined to seal the door and forget the room ever existed. But when I got down there, the door was open. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the open door, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't touched it since that day. I hadn't even gone near it. But now it was wide open. I knew I shouldn't go inside, knew I should leave it alone. But something compelled me to move forward, to see what had changed. The room looked the same as it had before: the chair, the shelf, the writing on the wall. But this time, something was different. There was a new message scrawled on the wall, written in the same erratic handwriting as before. "It's out, Dot." I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind reeling. What was out? What had I let out? That night, the scratching returned, but this time, it wasn't coming from the walls of the hidden room. It was coming from inside my house. I lay in bed, frozen in fear, listening as the scratching moved through the walls, closer and closer. It wasn't just nails against wood anymore. It was something heavier, something dragging itself through the house. And then I heard it, a soft creak, like a door slowly opening. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the basement. I grabbed my phone, dialing the police, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what was happening. They told me to stay on the line, to wait until they arrived. But the sound, the dragging, the creaking was getting closer. I couldn't wait. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I was halfway down the street, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I didn't care about the house anymore. I didn't care about the hidden room or what I had found inside. All I knew was that whatever I had let out was still in there. And it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, like so many others before it. My wife and I had just put our baby daughter, Lily, to bed, and we finally had a moment to relax. It was around 10:30 p.m., and we were sitting on the couch, watching TV, when I heard it. A voice. I froze, my hand hovering over the remote, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, barely audible over the hum of the television, but it was unmistakable, a voice coming through the baby monitor. At first, I thought it was just Lily babbling in her sleep, the way babies sometimes do. But as I turned down the volume on the TV, I realized that the voice wasn't hers. It was deeper, slower, and clearly not that of a child. It was someone else. I stared at the baby monitor, my heart racing. The small screen showed Lily lying peacefully in her crib, the soft glow of her nightlight casting gentle shadows across the room. She wasn't moving, and the room was silent. But the voice was still there. Someone was in her room. I grabbed my wife's arm, my voice barely a whisper. "Do you hear that?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear as we both listened, straining to make out the words. The voice was soft, almost soothing, like someone whispering a lullaby. But there was something off about it, something that sent a chill down my spine. "I think we should check on her," my wife said, her voice shaking. Without hesitation, we both stood up and rushed down the hallway, our hearts pounding in our chests. When we reached Lily's room, everything looked normal. She was still lying in her crib, sound asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. There was no one else there. But as we stood there, staring down at her, the baby monitor crackled to life again. The voice returned, louder this time, clearer. "She's such a beautiful baby, Dot." I froze, my blood turning to ice as the words echoed through the room. My wife gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as we both turned to look at the baby monitor. The screen was showing Lily, as it always did, but there was something else, something that hadn't been there before. A shadow. It was faint, barely noticeable at first, but there, near the corner of the room, was a dark, indistinct shape, hovering just out of the camera's reach. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. I quickly scanned the room, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, nothing but Lily, peacefully asleep in her crib. I picked up the baby monitor, my hands trembling as I moved the camera around, trying to find the source of the shadow. But every time I moved the camera, the shadow seemed to shift, staying just out of view, always lingering at the edge of the frame. The voice returned, softer this time, almost a whisper. "Don't worry, I'll take care of her, Dot." I backed away from the crib, my heart racing, my mind reeling. Who was saying this? Who was in my daughter's room? My wife grabbed my arm, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave." We hurried out of the room, taking Lily with us, my hands trembling as I cradled her against my chest. The baby monitor crackled again, the voice growing fainter, more distant. "She's mine, Dot." I slammed the door shut behind us, my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't believe what I had just heard, what I had just seen. The voice, the shadow, it didn't make sense. There was no one else in the house. We were alone, weren't we? For the rest of the night, we kept Lily with us, refusing to put her back in her crib. We tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice, soft and unsettling, whispering through the baby monitor. By morning, we were both exhausted, barely able to process what had happened. I wanted to believe it had been a glitch, some kind of interference, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken to us. It had spoken about Lily. And it wasn't finished. Over the next few days, I avoided using the baby monitor as much as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt different, colder, darker. Every time I walked past Lily's room, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if something was watching me. Then, one night, it happened again. I had just put Lily to bed and was sitting in the living room when the baby monitor crackled to life. At first, it was just static, a low hum of white noise that filled the room. But then I heard the voice. "She's waiting for M.E. Dot." My blood ran cold. I grabbed the baby monitor, my hands shaking as I stared at the screen. Lily was in her crib, just like before, but there was something different about the room this time. The shadows were darker, deeper, as if the light wasn't reaching every corner. And then I saw it. The shadow. It was back, but this time it wasn't lingering at the edge of the frame. It was closer, much closer, standing near the crib, hovering over my daughter. I felt a wave of panic surge through me as I rushed toward Lily's room, my heart pounding in my chest. I threw open the door, my breath catching in my throat as I looked around the room. Nothing. The room was empty. Just Lily, fast asleep in her crib, her soft breathing the only sound in the room. I picked her up, cradling her in my arms as I looked around, searching for any sign of the shadow of the voice. But there was nothing, no sign that anyone had been there at all. As I stood there, holding Lily close, the baby monitor crackled again. The voice was softer now, almost a whisper. "You can't keep her from M.E. I felt a wave of fear wash over me as I rushed out of the room, my mind racing. Who was this? What did they want with my daughter? I couldn't make sense of it, couldn't explain what was happening. All I knew was that I couldn't let Lily stay in that room. For the next few nights, we kept her with us, refusing to leave her alone, refusing to turn on the baby monitor. But the house didn't feel safe anymore. Every time I walked past her room, I felt it, that cold, creeping sensation, like something was waiting, just out of sight. Then, one night after days of sleepless fear, I decided to turn the baby monitor on again. I needed to know if the voice was still there, if the shadow was still watching. I sat in the living room, the monitor in my lap, the screen showing Lily fast asleep in our room. For a while, everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the monitor's static. And then, just as I was about to turn it off, the voice returned. "You'll never escape M.E. I stared at the monitor, my heart racing, my hands trembling. The screen flickered, the image distorting for a moment before going dark. I tried to turn it back on, but the monitor wouldn't respond. The screen stayed black, the voice fading into the static. But I knew it was still there. I rushed to check on Lily, my heart pounding in my chest as I burst into the room. She was still asleep, her tiny body curled up under the blankets. But the air felt different, colder, heavier, as if the very walls were closing in around us. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. The next morning, I threw the baby monitor away, hoping that would put an end to it. But the voice, the shadow, stayed with me. Every night, I heard it in my dreams, soft and whispering, just beyond the edge of my consciousness. "She's mine now, Dot." It all started with a text one that seemed innocent enough at first. I was sitting in my car after work, getting ready to head home, when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, expecting a message from a friend or a reminder from a work app. But it was from an unknown number. "How was your day, Sarah?" I frowned. I didn't recognize the number, and the way the message was phrased was unsettling, like it came from someone who knew me well. Still, I figured it had to be a wrong number. I ignored it, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A few minutes later, another text came through. "Heading home now?" I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't told anyone I was leaving work. I looked around, scanning the parking lot, but there was no one near my car. No one who could have known I was getting ready to head home. I responded, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed. "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "You'll find out soon enough, Dot." My stomach twisted in knots. Was this a joke? Was someone messing with me? I looked around again, my pulse quickening, but the parking lot was mostly empty. I shoved my phone into my bag, started the car, and drove home, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. When I got home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was no one. I convinced myself it was a prank, something stupid that would blow over. That night, I put my phone on silent and tried to forget about the texts. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the unknown sender watching me, tracking my every move. The next morning, I woke up to another text. "Sleep well?" My blood ran cold. Whoever this was, they hadn't stopped. They were still watching, still keeping tabs on me. I felt my heart race as I typed out another reply. "Who are you? What do you want?" The response was almost immediate. Don't worry, I'm just looking out for you, Dot. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning with fear and confusion. Why would someone say that? Who would go to the trouble of sending these messages? I didn't know anyone who would do something like this, at least I didn't think I did. I tried to block the number, hoping that would end it. But later that afternoon, as I was leaving for lunch, another text came through. Nice outfit, Sarah. Red looks good on you, Dot. I stopped dead in my tracks. I was wearing a red sweater that day. My hands shook as I looked around, scanning the street for anyone suspicious, but no one stood out. The realization hit me hard. Someone was watching me, and they were getting closer. I rushed back to my office, my heart racing, and locked myself in the bathroom. I didn't know what to do. The texts were getting creepier, more personal. Whoever this was, they knew too much. But how? I decided to call the police. I explained the situation, but without any concrete threats, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to block the number again, to be careful, and to let them know if anything escalated. That night, I tried to convince myself that it would stop. Maybe the person would get bored and move on. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. At around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what they had sent. But I had to know. I'm outside, Dot. My heart pounded in my chest. I rushed to the window, peering out into the dark street. There was nothing, no one. But the message hung in the air, filling me with a deep sense of dread. My mind raced as I checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. Just as I finished locking the back door, another text came through. You can't keep me out, Dot. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Whoever this was, they were playing some kind of sick game, and I didn't know how to stop it. I called the police again, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. They promised to send someone to check the area, but by the time they arrived, there was no one outside. For the next few days, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the texts kept coming. They described everything I did, what I wore, where I went, who I talked to. Whoever this was, they were always watching, always lurking just out of sight. Then, one night, I got a message that made my blood run cold. I'm coming inside, Dot. I bolted up from the couch, my heart racing as I checked the front door. It was locked, just as I had left it. I moved to the back door, locked. Every window locked. Another text came through. I'm already here, Dot. Panic surged through me as I rushed through the house, checking every room, every corner. But there was no one. The house was empty. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a picture. A picture of me. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The photo was taken from behind me, right where I was sitting on the couch just moments before. My blood ran cold as I realized what that meant. The person wasn't outside. They had been inside the whole time. I called the police again, my voice frantic as I explained what had happened. They sent officers to my house immediately, but by the time they arrived, the person was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in the house. But I knew they had been there. I could feel it. I spent the next few days staying with a friend, too terrified to be alone in my own house. I thought about leaving the city, starting over somewhere new, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Whoever this was, they wouldn't stop. They would find me again. The texts continued, even after I changed my number, even after I got a new phone. Each message more personal than the last. You can't escape ME. I know everything about you. We'll be together soon. I blocked every number they used, but new ones kept coming. It didn't matter what I did, they always found a way to reach me. The texts haunted my every waking moment, filling me with a constant sense of dread. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I was sitting in bed, my heart racing as I read the latest text. I'm right outside your room, Dot. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone, frantically dialing 911, but before I could hit the call button, another message came through. Don't bother. It's too late, Dot. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear it now, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway outside my room. I backed up against the wall, my pulse thundering in my ears. The door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint light from the hallway. I couldn't make out their face, couldn't see who they were. And then they spoke. I told you. I know everything about you, Dot. I never saw their face. I never found out who they were. All I know is that, from that moment on, my life was never the same. The text stopped after that night, but the fear didn't. Every time I hear my phone buzz, my heart skips a beat. Every time I'm alone in the house, I feel their presence, watching, waiting. Because I know that one day the text will start again. And this time, there won't be anywhere left to run. I had always considered myself lucky to have quiet neighbors. Living in an old apartment building with thin walls, I was used to hearing everything, people arguing, kids running down the hall, the faint hum of music coming from next door. But my new neighbor was different. He kept to himself, never made any noise, and seemed polite enough the few times I'd bumped into him in the hallway. For the first few months, I didn't think much about him at all. That all changed when the notes started appearing. It began innocently enough, just a slip of paper under my door, scrawled in messy handwriting, I see you, Dot. At first, I thought it was a joke, maybe a prank by one of the neighborhood kids. I crumpled it up and threw it away without giving it much thought. But a few days later, another note appeared. I'm watching you, Dot. This time I felt a chill run down my spine. The handwriting was the same, jagged, uneven, like it had been written in a hurry. I glanced around the hallway, but there was no one in sight. I started to feel uneasy. Who was leaving these notes? Was it a joke? Or something more sinister? I tried to brush it off, but as the days went by, more notes appeared, each one more unsettling than the last. I know when you're alone, Dot. You can't hide from me, Dot. I see everything, Dot. By now, I was thoroughly creeped out. I checked my locks every night, double-checking the windows to make sure they were shut tight. But no matter how careful I was, the notes kept coming. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I found a new note tucked under my door. This one was different, shorter, more direct. I'm closer than you think, Dot. My blood ran cold. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, someone who knew my routine, my schedule, someone who was far too close for comfort. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old building, every sound from the neighboring apartments sent my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the notes were probably a prank. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then, one evening, as I was sitting on the couch, I heard it, an unmistakable sound. Breathing. I froze, my heart racing as I strained to listen. It wasn't coming from outside, and it wasn't the kind of muffled noise you'd expect from thin walls. It was close, too close, like someone was just on the other side of the room, hidden behind the walls. I stood up, my pulse pounding in my ears as I moved slowly around the apartment. The breathing continued, soft and deliberate, as if someone was deliberately trying not to be heard. I pressed my ear against the wall, my skin prickling with unease. And then I heard it. A voice. It was faint, barely audible, but I could hear it, someone whispering my name. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at the wall. I knew what I had heard, and it wasn't my imagination. Someone was behind the walls. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I called the building manager. My voice was shaking as I explained what had been happening, the notes, the breathing, the voice. The manager seemed skeptical at first, but I insisted that something wasn't right. He promised to check it out in the morning. That night, I locked myself in my bedroom, refusing to sleep in the living room. I pushed the dresser against the door, my heart racing with every sound I heard. I could feel it now, something wasn't just watching me. It was closer than ever. The next morning, the building manager knocked on my door. He looked tired, like he'd been up all night thinking about my call. I checked the neighboring apartment, he said, rubbing his neck. The tenant your neighbor moved out a few months ago. No one's been living there since. I stared at him in disbelief. That's impossible. I've heard someone in there. I've seen him. The manager shook his head. It's been vacant since the last guy left. I don't know what to tell you. My stomach dropped. How could it be vacant? I had seen my neighbor just a few days ago, in fact, and I had heard someone moving around in the apartment more than once. I decided to take matters into my own hands. That night, I stayed up late, listening for the sounds again. I knew they were real. I wasn't imagining them. And if no one was living next door, that meant the noises, the breathing, the whispering, they were coming from somewhere else. As the clock ticked past midnight, I heard it again, the faint sound of breathing, this time clearer, more distinct. It was coming from the wall near my bed, the same wall that separated my apartment from the vacant one next door. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear to the wall, listening carefully. And then, just as before, I heard it, the voice. I can see you, Dot. I pulled away from the wall, my skin crawling with fear. Whoever was behind the wall knew I was there. They knew I could hear them. I grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the wall. My hands shook as I tapped on the surface, listening for any hollow spots. The wall sounded solid, but something wasn't right. The sounds were too clear, too close. That's when I noticed the small, almost imperceptible crack running along the baseboard, right where the wall met the floor. It was faint, barely noticeable, but as I crouched down for a closer look, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a small hole in the wall. Not a large hole, but just big enough to see through. My breath caught in my throat as I peered through the hole. On the other side, I saw the empty apartment, dark, silent, just as the building manager had said. But there, in the corner of the room, was a figure. A man. He was standing perfectly still, his face obscured by shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me. He wasn't moving, wasn't saying anything, just standing there, watching. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. The building manager had said the apartment was empty, that no one had been living there for months. But I had seen someone. Someone was in there. Someone who had been watching me through the walls. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The image of the man, standing in the shadows, burned into my mind. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside sent my nerves on edge. The next day, I demanded that the building manager inspect the neighboring apartment again. Reluctantly, he agreed. We both entered the apartment together, the door creaking as we stepped inside. It was exactly as he had described, empty, abandoned, dust collecting on the floors. There was no furniture, no signs of life, just the hollow echo of our footsteps as we moved through the space. But then I showed him the wall. I pointed to the small hole I had found, my hands shaking as I explained what I had seen, what I had heard. The manager frowned, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern as he crouched down to inspect it. "That's not supposed to be here," he muttered, more to himself than to me. He promised to have the wall sealed, to make sure no one could see through it again. But I could tell by the look on his face that he was just as unnerved as I was. I moved out a few days later. I couldn't stay there. Not after everything that had happened. Not after what I had seen. The idea of someone watching me through the walls, silently observing my every move, was too much to bear. But even now, months later, I still feel it. The sensation of being watched. The feeling that someone somewhere is always looking. Because I never found out who was behind that wall. And I never found out how long they had been watching me. You need to leave. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced around the room. There was no one there, just the empty space, cold and suffocating. She rushed back to the door, banging on it with her fist, but the wood didn't give. Her hands shook as she tried the knob again, but it was still stuck. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced down, dread washing over her. I'm in the room. Emma froze, her body going cold. Slowly, she turned, her flashlight trembling as she swept it across the empty room. But it wasn't empty anymore. There, standing in the corner, was a figure. It was barely visible in the faint light, but it was there, tall, shadowy, and watching her. Emma's breath hitched as she stumbled back, her pulse racing. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread, like something out of one of those scary short stories to read online that always left her feeling unsettled. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, its eyes glinting in the dark, watching her. Emma's phone buzzed again, but she couldn't bring herself to look at it. She was frozen, her back pressed against the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, slowly, the figure began to move. It took one step forward, then another, its eyes never leaving hers. Emma's breath came in short, panic bursts as she reached for the door again, pulling desperately at the knob. But it wouldn't open. Her phone buzzed once more, the screen glowing in the darkness. "Don't turn around." Emma's blood ran cold. She was trapped, the figure drawing closer with each passing second. She could feel the weight of its gaze, the oppressive presence pressing down on her. Suddenly, the door behind her gave way, swinging open with a loud creak. Emma didn't hesitate. She bolted out of the room, her feet barely touching the floor as she raced down the hallway. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she reached the stairs, practically throwing herself down them. As she reached the bottom, she glanced back at the hallway. The door at the end was closed again, the figure nowhere to be seen. But the house felt different now, darker, more sinister. Her phone buzzed one final time, and she glanced down at the screen, her hands shaking. "I'll be waiting." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she grabbed her keys and fled the house, the old wooden door slamming shut behind her. She didn't look back as she drove away, but the feeling of being watched stayed with her. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't done with her. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, just a weekend getaway for a group of friends. Lauren, Nick, and Beth had been planning the trip for months, excited to spend a few days in the wilderness, away from the noise and stress of city life. The campsite was deep in the woods, far from any main roads, with nothing but towering trees and a small lake nearby. It sounded like the perfect place to unwind. But as the sun began to set on their first night, a strange sense of unease settled over the camp. Lauren had always been the adventurous type, a fan of good horror novels and scary stories to read in the dark. She loved the thrill of the unknown, the idea that something might be lurking just beyond the firelight. But tonight, something about the woods felt wrong. The trees seemed too tall, the darkness too deep. It was the kind of setting that reminded her of those scary campfire stories where the danger is always closer than you think. Nick tossed another log onto the fire, sending sparks up into the night sky. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, noticing the way Lauren stared out into the darkness. She shrugged, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess. The woods are a little creepy at night." Beth, always the practical one, rolled her eyes. "It's just your imagination, Lauren. You've been reading too many horror stories." Lauren laughed, but her unease didn't fade. As the fire crackled, she kept glancing toward the tree line, feeling like something was watching them. The air was still too quiet. Even the usual sounds of the forest chirping insects and rustling leaves were absent. And then she saw him. At first she thought it was a trick of the firelight, but there, just beyond the trees, stood a figure. Tall, dark, barely visible in the shadows. Lauren's heart skipped a beat as she stared, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "Do you guys see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Nick and Beth looked up, following her gaze, but the figure was gone. "See what?" Nick asked, frowning. "There was someone out there," Lauren insisted, her voice rising. "I saw someone standing by the trees." Beth sighed. "It's probably just another camper. There are other people around, you know." But Lauren wasn't convinced. The figure had been too still, too quiet. It hadn't moved like a normal person. It had just stood there, watching. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her attention away from the dark woods. She pulled it out, her hands shaking slightly. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "I'm watching you." Lauren's stomach twisted with fear. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the message, her mind racing. She looked up at Nick and Beth, but they were talking quietly, oblivious to the growing sense of dread that was gripping her. She quickly typed a reply, "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately. "I'm closer than you think." Lauren's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced around the campsite, the firelight casting long shadows over the tents and trees. Her hands trembled as she shoved her phone back into her pocket, trying to push down the rising panic. "Maybe we should pack up and leave in the morning," she suggested, her voice shaky. Nick raised an eyebrow. "Leave? We just got here." Beth sighed again, but before she could say anything, the sound of a twig snapping echoed from the trees. All three of them froze, their eyes darting to the darkness beyond the firelight. There was a soft rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Nick stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, just silence. Lauren's heart raced as the footsteps stopped. The fire flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw the figure again, just a glimpse of movement in the trees. "We should go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nick laughed nervously. "It's probably just some animal. Relax." But Lauren couldn't relax. Something was out there, watching them. She could feel it. Her phone buzzed again, and she hesitated before pulling it out. "I don't turn around." Her blood ran cold. She didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was behind her. But she couldn't help herself. Slowly she turned, her heart pounding in her chest. There, standing just beyond the trees, was the figure. It was closer now, its face still hidden in the shadows, but its eyes gleamed in the firelight. Lauren gasped, stumbling backward, her breath coming in short, panic bursts. "We need to go. Now." Nick and Beth finally seemed to sense the urgency in her voice. Nick grabbed his backpack, throwing it over his shoulder. "All right, let's go. This place is giving me the creeps." They quickly packed up their gear, the fire still crackling behind them. As they made their way toward the car, Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was following them, lurking just beyond the light of their flashlights. Her phone buzzed again, and with trembling hands, she checked the message. "I'm right behind you." Lauren's breath hitched as she glanced over her shoulder. The figure was gone, but the trees seemed darker now, the path ahead twisting into the unknown. They reached the car, tossing their bags into the trunk. As Nick fumbled with the keys, Lauren's phone buzzed one final time. "You can't leave." Panic surged through her as the engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, leaving the campsite behind. The figure was gone, but the dread stayed with her, clinging to her like a shadow. Whatever had been watching them in the woods wasn't gone, and deep down, Lauren knew it wasn't done with them. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to hit like. What would you do if you saw someone watching you in the woods? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you'd handle this creepy situation. And if you enjoy scary stories to read online, don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling tales that will keep you up at night. There's always something lurking in the shadows. It was nearing midnight when Claire first heard the knock. She had been curled up on her couch, watching an old horror movie with the lights off. The steady hum of the rain outside had been lulling her into a relaxed state when the sharp sound snapped her back to reality. 3 distinct knocks echoed from the front door, quick and deliberate. Claire paused the movie, frowning. Who could be knocking at this hour? She lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where unexpected visitors after dark were unheard of. The feeling in the pit of her stomach reminded her of the good horror novels she loved reading, where innocent noises often led to terrifying discoveries. She stood up slowly, her heart beginning to race as she walked toward the front door. The hallway was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of her TV. Another knock sounded 3 times, just like before. Claire hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat. No one was there. Claire's mind raced. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe some teenagers were messing around, trying to scare her. She shook her head, laughing nervously to herself. She had been reading too many scary stories to tell her imagination was getting the better of her. But even as she tried to shake off the fear, a chill ran down her spine. Something about this didn't feel right. She locked the door and turned back toward the living room. But before she could take another step, there was a third knock, this time louder, more urgent. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out, her hands shaking slightly. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Let me in." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She stared at the message, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Who was texting her? Who was at her door? Her fingers trembled as she typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "I'm outside." Panic surged through her as she glanced toward the door. She moved quickly to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The street was empty, rain softly falling under the glow of the streetlights. No one was there. Her phone buzzed again. Look again. Claire's blood ran cold. She backed away from the window, her pulse racing. There was no one outside, she was sure of it. But the messages, they kept coming. She locked the door, double-checking it, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Another knock. This time it wasn't from the front door. It came from the back of the house. Claire spun around, her mind racing. The back door. She hadn't checked it. Her heart pounded as she ran to the kitchen, flicking on the lights. The rain tapped against the windows, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence of the house. She reached the back door, her hands shaking as she peered through the small window. Her breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the backyard, was a figure. It was tall, its face obscured by the shadows, standing perfectly still in the rain. Claire's pulse quickened as she stumbled back, nearly dropping her phone. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching her. Her phone buzzed again. "Let me in." Claire's mind screamed at her to run, but her feet were frozen in place. Who was this person? How had they found her? She had never seen anyone like this before. But there was something about the figure that felt familiar, like a forgotten face from a distant nightmare. The figure took a step closer to the door. Claire backed away, her breath coming in panic bursts. She grabbed her phone and typed frantically, "What do you want?" The reply came instantly. "You invited me." Her heart pounded in her chest as her mind raced. Invited? What was this person talking about? She had never invited anyone over. She glanced at the figure again. It was closer now, just a few feet from the door. She could feel the dread settling over her, cold and suffocating. The house, once her refuge, now felt like a trap. Her phone buzzed once more. "I'm coming in." The scream caught in Claire's throat as she bolted for the living room, her hands shaking as she grabbed her phone. She dialed 911, her fingers trembling so badly that she almost dropped the phone. The line rang once, twice before cutting out completely. The lights flickered. The knocking came again this time, from the front door. Claire's mind raced as she backed into the living room, her eyes darting from the front door to the windows. The figure had disappeared from the backyard, but she knew it was still there, waiting. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. Her phone buzzed again, and though she didn't want to look, she couldn't help herself. She glanced at the screen, her hands trembling. "I'm inside." Claire's breath hitched as she turned, her eyes scanning the room. The house was silent, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. She could feel it, the presence, the weight of unseen eyes, lurking just beyond her vision. And then she saw it. In the reflection of the darkened TV screen, standing just behind her, was the figure. Her scream echoed through the house as she stumbled away, her heart pounding in her ears. But when she turned, the figure was gone. The house was silent again, the only sound the soft tapping of the rain against the windows. Her phone buzzed one final time. "I'm here now." Ethan had always been a night owl, often finding himself deep in thought while everyone else was asleep. Tonight he sat at his desk, the only light in the room coming from the small lamp by his side. His apartment was quiet, the hum of the city far below barely reaching him. Ethan liked these moments, where it was just him, his thoughts, and the occasional good horror novel to pass the time. But tonight, something was different. He couldn't stop staring at the drawer in his desk. It was the bottom drawer, always locked, and as far as Ethan knew, he didn't have the key. It had come with the desk when he'd bought it secondhand, and he'd never thought much of it. But lately, the drawer had been on his mind. For weeks now, every time he sat at his desk, he found himself glancing at it, wondering what was inside. It reminded him of one of those scary stories to tell, where something seemingly innocent turns into a gateway to something far more sinister. Tonight, the curiosity was too much to resist. Ethan got up from his chair and rummaged through his drawers, searching for something, anything that might open the lock. He tried a few paper clips, the tip of a knife, even an old bobby pin, but nothing worked. Frustrated, he sat back down, staring at the drawer as if willing it to open. And then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed on the desk. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Don't open it." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the message, confused. Who would send something like that? His eyes darted around the room, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. His apartment was empty. He was alone. He typed back quickly, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "It's locked for a reason." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He glanced back at the drawer, his mind racing. Was someone watching him? His apartment was on the 5th floor, far above the street below, but the message felt too personal, too timely. Suddenly, the drawer rattled. Ethan jumped, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes locked onto the desk, watching as the drawer shook slightly, as if something inside was trying to get out. The rattling stopped as quickly as it had started, but the feeling of dread lingered in the air. His phone buzzed again. Leave it alone. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for the drawer, ignoring the warning. His curiosity was too strong now, and he had to know what was inside. He grabbed a small hammer from his toolkit, and with one swift movement, broke the lock. The drawer creaked as it slid open, revealing its contents. Inside was a small, black notebook, worn and faded with age. Ethan's pulse quickened as he picked it up, the pages crinkling under his fingers. The book felt cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been sitting in a freezer rather than a desk drawer. He flipped it open, expecting to find notes, sketches, something mundane. But instead, the pages were filled with strange symbols written in black ink, each one more intricate than the last. The handwriting was frantic, almost desperate, as if whoever had written it had been in a rush or worse, terrified. His phone buzzed again, and with shaking hands, he checked the message. "You shouldn't have done that." Ethan's heart raced as he glanced around the room. The air felt colder now, thicker, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in the past few minutes. His breath fogged in front of him as he stared at the notebook, the symbols seeming to shift and move on the page, even though he wasn't turning it. The lights in his apartment flickered. Suddenly, a loud knock came from the front door. Ethan jumped to his feet, his mind racing. Who could be knocking at this hour? He grabbed his phone, his heart pounding in his chest. The message on the screen made his blood run cold. "Don't answer." His hands trembled as the knocking continued, louder and more insistent this time. Ethan backed away from the door, his pulse racing. He glanced at the notebook still lying on the desk, its pages now open to a symbol he hadn't seen before. It was larger than the others, more complex, and as he stared at it, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan's phone buzzed again. "I'm here." His breath hitched as he backed further into the room, his eyes darting between the door and the notebook. The air was thick with dread, the temperature so cold now that he could see his breath hanging in the air. Suddenly the lights flickered again, and with a loud pop, the bulb in his lamp went out, plunging the room into darkness. Ethan's heart raced as he grabbed his phone, using the screen to cast a faint light across the room. The notebook lay open on the desk, the symbols glowing faintly in the dark. And then, from the corner of the room, came the sound of breathing. Ethan froze, his eyes wide as he slowly turned toward the sound. There, in the shadows, he saw a figure, barely visible, its face obscured by the darkness. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was toying with him. His phone buzzed again. Too late. The figure moved closer, its face coming into view pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Ethan backed up against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure reached out a hand toward the desk, toward the notebook. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room was silent again, the air still heavy with the weight of whatever had just happened. Ethan's phone buzzed one final time, and with trembling hands he looked at the screen. "You belong to it now." His breath hitched as he stared at the message. He glanced at the notebook, the strange symbols still glowing faintly on the page. Whatever he had unlocked, whatever he had disturbed, wasn't done with him. Olivia had never been particularly superstitious, but there was something about mirrors that unsettled her. Growing up, her grandmother had always told her not to stare into the mirror for too long at night. "They show more than just your reflection," she would say with a serious look in her eyes. Olivia had always laughed it off, attributing her grandmother's warnings to old folklore. But tonight, alone in her new apartment, her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. The mirror in her bedroom was an antique, left behind by the previous tenants. It stood tall and ornate, its edges framed with intricate carvings. Olivia had planned to replace it, but the mirror had a strange allure, and she never got around to it. Now, as she got ready for bed, the mirror seemed to take on a life of its own, reflecting more than just her image. The apartment was quiet, the night outside still, but something about the reflection caught her eye. For a split second, Olivia thought she saw movement in the mirror, like a shadow passing behind her. She whipped around, her heart racing, but the room was empty. She laughed nervously to herself, brushing it off as her imagination. She had been reading too many scary short stories to read online, filling her head with ideas of haunted objects and eerie reflections. Still, as she climbed into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her attention away from the mirror. She picked it up, expecting a late-night text from a friend, but her stomach tightened when she saw the message. "Don't look into the mirror." The message came from an unknown number. Olivia's pulse quickened as she stared at the screen. Her eyes darted to the mirror, and a chill ran down her spine. How could someone know? She typed back quickly, her hands shaking. "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "Don't turn around." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared at the phone. She slowly turned her head, her eyes locking onto the mirror. There, standing in the reflection, was a shadowy figure. It was faint, almost invisible in the dim light of the room, but it was there standing right behind her. Olivia's blood ran cold as she spun around, expecting to see someone in her bedroom. But the room was empty. Her phone buzzed again. "I'm still here." Olivia's heart raced as she backed up against the wall, her eyes darting between the mirror and her phone. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread lingered, heavy and suffocating. She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she typed back, "What do you want?" The reply was instant. "Watch the mirror." Her pulse quickened as she forced herself to look at the mirror again. This time the reflection was different. The room behind her looked darker, the shadows longer, more menacing. And then she saw the figure again, but closer now, its outline barely visible in the darkness. Olivia's breath hitched as she stepped back, her heart pounding in her ears. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her. Her phone buzzed again. "Don't run." Panic surged through her as she bolted for the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. She threw open the door and rushed into the hallway, her heart racing as she made her way to the living room. She didn't stop until she reached the front door, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. The line rang once, twice, and then went silent. Her phone buzzed one more time. "You can't escape." Olivia's blood ran cold as she backed away from the front door, her mind racing. She glanced down the hallway toward her bedroom, the open door casting an eerie shadow on the floor. The mirror loomed just beyond the doorway, its surface dark and menacing. And then, from the darkness, she saw it. The figure stepped out of the reflection, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as it moved closer, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. She stumbled backward, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the door. But the figure was faster. It was right behind her now, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't need to look. "I'm here." Olivia's scream echoed through the empty apartment as the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. After moving into her new apartment, Mia was excited to finally have a place of her own. The building was old, with high ceilings, wooden floors, and vintage fixtures that gave it a classic charm. It was perfect, or so she thought. The first few weeks were peaceful enough. Mia spent her time decorating, unpacking boxes, and settling into her new life. But soon, strange things started to happen. It began with the noises. At first, it was just faint scratching sounds at night. Mia brushed it off as the building settling, or maybe the sound of a mouse in the walls. But the noises grew louder, more deliberate, like someone or something was moving inside the walls. It reminded her of the good horror novels she loved, where the protagonist hears something no one else can explain, something that shouldn't be there. One night, as she lay in bed, Mia heard it again scratching, followed by a soft whisper. Her heart raced as she sat up, straining to hear. The whisper was faint, almost like it was calling her name. She shook her head, telling herself she was imagining it. She had been reading too many scary short stories to read online, filling her mind with eerie ideas. But as the night went on, the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. The next day, Mia told herself it had just been a bad dream. The old building had its quirks, and her mind was playing tricks on her. She went about her day, trying to forget about the strange sounds. But as the sun set and the apartment grew quiet, the whisper returned. It was clearer this time. "Mia." Her breath caught in her throat. She stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes darting around the empty space. The whisper seemed to come from the walls, but how could that be possible? Her pulse quickened as the sound grew louder, filling the room with a strange, suffocating presence. Mia grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed her friend, Sarah. She needed someone to talk to, someone to tell her she wasn't going crazy. "Hey Mia, what's up?" Sarah answered cheerfully. "There's something in my apartment," Mia whispered, glancing around the room. "I think I'm hearing voices." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Voices? Like someone in your apartment?" "No, not like that," Mia replied, her voice shaking. "It's coming from the walls." Sarah laughed, clearly not taking her seriously. "You've been reading too many scary stories to tell, Mia. Old buildings make noises. It's probably just the pipes." Mia forced a laugh, trying to calm herself down. "Yeah, maybe." But as she hung up, the whisper came again, louder this time. "Mia, I'm waiting." Her phone buzzed in her hand, making her jump. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Listen closely." Mia's blood ran cold. Her hands shook as she typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "Behind you." She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly she turned, her breath catching as she stared at the wall behind her. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if it was coming from inside the walls themselves. Suddenly the scratching started again, louder this time, like something was trying to claw its way out. Mia stumbled back, her heart racing as she stared at the wall. The whispering grew clearer, forming words that chilled her to the bone. "Let me out." Her hands shook as she grabbed a chair, pressing her ear to the wall, desperate to understand what was happening. The voice was faint but unmistakable. "Let me out, Mia." Panic surged through her as she backed away from the wall. This wasn't normal. This wasn't her imagination. She needed to get out of the apartment. She grabbed her phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but before she could dial, her phone buzzed again. "Don't leave." Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the message. She backed toward the front door, her hand reaching for the doorknob, but the voice stopped her. "If you leave, I'll follow." Her breath hitched as she stood frozen in place. The voice was right behind her now, louder, more menacing. "Let me out." Mia grabbed her keys and bolted for the door, her pulse racing as she flung it open and ran into the hallway. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts as she made her way down the stairs and out into the street. The cold night air hit her like a wave, but it did little to calm her nerves. Her phone buzzed again, and though she didn't want to look, she couldn't help herself. "I'm still here." Mia's heart sank. She glanced up at the building, her apartment window looming above her like a dark, ominous eye. The whisper was still there, faint but unmistakable, following her even now. She couldn't escape it. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when Leah found the photograph. She had been cleaning out her grandmother's attic, sorting through old boxes of memories that had been tucked away for years. The room smelled of dust and time, filled with old books, furniture, and forgotten treasures. Leah had always loved exploring the attic as a child, but today there was something different in the air, something heavy, like the weight of forgotten stories. As she sorted through the dusty boxes, one item caught her attention. It was an old photo album, its cover worn and frayed with age. She flipped through the pages, smiling at the faded black and white pictures of family gatherings, old houses, and moments long past. But then, toward the back of the album, she found a photograph she didn't recognize. The photo was of her grandmother's house, the one she was standing in now. But something was off. In the picture, there was a person standing in the window, staring out at the camera. The figure was blurry, almost like a shadow, but it sent a chill down Leah's spine. She didn't remember anyone living in the house at the time the photo was taken. The figure's face was obscured, but its presence felt undeniable. Leah held the photo closer, her heart beginning to race. The more she stared at it, the more unsettled she became. It was like something in the picture was watching her, even now, decades after it was taken. It reminded her of the eerie, scary short stories to read online, where old photographs held dark secrets. Her phone buzzed on the attic floor beside her, startling her. She picked it up, glancing at the screen. A message from an unknown number appeared. "Do you see me?" Leah's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the message, her hands trembling. How could someone know about the photo? She hadn't told anyone she was cleaning the attic, let alone that she had found the picture. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. She quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "I'm in the house." Leah's blood ran cold. She looked around the dusty attic, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was quiet, too quiet. She could hear the soft patter of rain on the roof, but otherwise there was nothing. No creaking floorboards, no distant voices, just silence. Suddenly the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on her. She typed back again, her hands shaking. "Where?" Another buzz. "Look in the photo." Leah's breath hitched as she glanced down at the photograph again. The figure in the window seemed clearer now, more defined. It was no longer a blurry silhouette. She could make out its face, a pale, hollow-eyed figure staring directly at her. Her stomach twisted with fear. She quickly dropped the photo, backing away from it as if it might leap off the page. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't want to look. She couldn't. But her curiosity got the better of her. "Come find me." Leah's heart pounded in her chest as she grabbed the photo album and rushed down the attic stairs, her feet barely touching the steps. She had to get out of the house. Whatever was in the photo, whatever was watching her, it wasn't safe. She ran into the living room, her mind racing, but as she reached for her coat, her phone buzzed one more time. Too late. Leah's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the doorway of the living room, was the figure from the photograph. Its face was exactly as she had seen in the picture, pale, hollow-eyed, with an expression that sent a wave of terror through her. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at her with those lifeless eyes. Leah stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her ears. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to type, but before she could, the lights in the house flickered. The figure was closer now. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts as she backed into the corner of the room, her eyes locked onto the figure. It was still moving, slowly but deliberately, its gaze never leaving hers. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The house was silent again, but the sense of dread hung in the air, suffocating. Leah stood frozen in place, her mind racing. Was it gone for good, or was it still watching her? Her phone buzzed again, and with trembling hands she looked at the screen. I'll be waiting. Leah's heart raced as she glanced at the old photograph one last time. The figure was still in the window, watching her, waiting for her to return. Whatever it wasn't finished with her yet. The rain tapped steadily against the windows as Emily unpacked the last of her boxes. She had just moved into the old Victorian house that had been in her family for generations. It was a grand, beautiful home with intricate woodwork, high ceilings, and large windows that let in the faint light of the stormy afternoon. But there was one room in the house that always made her uneasy, the parlor. It wasn't the room itself that bothered her, but the portrait that hung above the fireplace. The painting was of a young girl, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her dark hair pulled back in soft waves. The girl's eyes were piercing, almost lifelike, and no matter where you stood in the room, they seemed to follow you. As a child, Emily had always hated the portrait. Her grandmother had told her it was of a distant relative, long since passed, but there was something about the painting that felt wrong. Now, standing in the parlor again after so many years, the same unease washed over her. The girl's eyes seemed even more intense, as if they were watching her closely. Emily shook her head, trying to brush off the feeling. It was just a painting, nothing more. But as she moved around the room, unpacking books and setting up furniture, she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Later that evening, as the rain continued to fall and the house grew darker, Emily found herself sitting in the parlor, a cup of tea in her hands. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the room. The portrait loomed above her, the girl's eyes glinting in the firelight. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, expecting a message from a friend checking in, but her stomach tightened when she saw the text. She's watching you. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to the portrait, the girl's face seeming more menacing now. She quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "She doesn't like when you ignore her." A chill ran down Emily's spine. Her eyes flicked back to the portrait, and for a brief moment she thought she saw the girl's expression change. The soft, lifeless smile had shifted, becoming something darker. She stood up from the couch, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved closer to the portrait, her breath shallow. The girl's eyes were still locked on hers, but now they seemed almost angry. Emily backed away, her mind racing. It couldn't be real. It was just a painting, nothing more. But her phone buzzed again, and with trembling hands, she checked the message. "Don't turn your back on her." Emily's pulse quickened. She glanced around the room, her hands shaking. The shadows seemed to stretch farther now, the fire casting strange shapes on the walls. Her mind screamed at her to leave the room, to get out of the house, but her legs felt frozen in place. Slowly, she turned back to the painting, her heart pounding in her ears. The girl's eyes were no longer just watching her, they were glaring. The once soft features of the portrait had become twisted, angry. Emily's breath hitched as she stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. Her phone buzzed again. She's not happy. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air growing colder with each passing second. Emily backed away from the painting, her hands trembling as the shadows in the room grew darker. She needed to get out. Whatever was happening wasn't normal. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the fire, casting an eerie glow over the portrait. Emily's breath came in short, panic bursts as she grabbed her phone, her hands shaking. A soft creak echoed through the room. Emily froze, her heart racing. She turned slowly, her flashlight illuminating the corners of the room. There was no one there, just the soft crackling of the fire and the rain tapping against the windows. But when she turned back to the portrait, the girl was gone. Emily's blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, her phone falling to the floor with a clatter. The frame of the painting was still there, but the girl she wasn't. The canvas was blank, just an empty expanse of darkness. Her phone buzzed one final time, and though she didn't want to look, she couldn't help herself. "She's behind you." Emily's scream echoed through the house as she spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The parlor was empty, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. She grabbed her phone and bolted for the front door, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. As she reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, she glanced back toward the parlor. The portrait was back in place, the girl staring out from the canvas once again. But her expression was different now, calm, almost content. Emily's phone buzzed one last time. "She won't let you leave." If this story made you think twice about old portraits, don't forget to hit like. What would you do if a painting seemed to watch your every move? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you'd handle this chilling encounter. And if you enjoy scary stories to read online, be sure to subscribe for more eerie tales. You never know what might be watching. Max had always been curious about the locked basement door. Ever since moving into the old house a few months ago, he had explored every nook and cranny except for the basement. The previous owner had been clear, "Don't go down there. The door stays locked." Max had shrugged it off, assuming it was a warning to keep out of an unstable part of the house. But as the days passed, that door gnawed at his curiosity. One rainy night, Max finally decided to investigate. It felt like the kind of story you'd read in one of those good horror novels, the type where the main character ignores all the warnings and pays the price. He grabbed his keys, a flashlight, and made his way to the basement. The door was old, its wood cracked and warped from years of neglect. The key slid into the lock with a heavy click, and the door creaked open, revealing a steep set of stairs descending into darkness. Max hesitated, gripping the flashlight tightly. The air that wafted up from the basement was cold, musty, and heavy with a strange dampness. He flicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick dust hanging in the air. Slowly, he made his way down the stairs. The walls were made of stone, and the deeper he went, the colder it became. It felt like stepping into one of those scary stories to read in the dark, where the basement always hides something terrible. At the bottom of the stairs, Max found himself in a small, dimly lit room. The floor was dirt, uneven and cold under his feet. There were a few old tools scattered around, but the room was mostly empty except for one thing: a door. It was smaller than the first, wooden and bolted shut with heavy iron latches. Max's heart raced as he approached it, his flashlight flickering slightly. The door looked ancient, older than anything else in the house, and it was clear no one had touched it in years. He knelt down, examining the latch. It was rusty, but with some effort, he was able to pry it open. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out, expecting a message from a friend, but what he saw made his stomach drop. "Don't open it." The message was from an unknown number. Max stared at the screen, his hands shaking. How could someone know what he was doing? He glanced around the dark basement, half expecting to see someone watching him. But the room was empty. He quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "Turn back." Max's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at the small door, now unlatched, its wood creaking slightly in the silence of the basement. Everything in him screamed to leave it alone, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He placed his hand on the door and slowly pulled it open. The stench hit him first foul, like rotting wood and damp earth. His flashlight flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows across the small space beyond the door. There was a faint sound, like whispering, coming from deep inside. Max stepped into the room, his breath fogging in front of him. The temperature had dropped even further, and the whispering grew louder. It was almost like the walls themselves were alive, murmuring in a language he couldn't understand. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. Max spun around, his heart racing. He rushed to the door, trying to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a faint sound, it was a chorus of voices, angry and demanding. His phone buzzed again. You shouldn't have opened it. Max's hands shook as he fumbled with his phone, typing back what's happening. The reply came immediately. They're coming. The whispering intensified, filling the room like a storm. Max's flashlight flickered violently, casting erratic beams of light across the small space. He backed away from the door, his mind racing, his breath coming in short, panic bursts. And then he saw them. Figures, faint and shadowy, began to form in the corners of the room. Their outlines were barely visible, but their eyes cold, hollow eyes glowed in the darkness. Max's pulse quickened as he stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering out completely, plunging him into darkness. The whispering was all around him now, close, suffocating. He could feel their presence, closing in on him, their cold breath on his neck. His phone buzzed again. It's too late. Max's heart pounded as he backed against the wall, his hands trembling as he tried to turn the flashlight back on. But the room was too dark, and the whispering was too loud. The figures were closer now, their eyes fixed on him. He could feel the cold closing in, wrapping around him like a vice. The air was thick with dread, and Max knew deep down that whatever he had unleashed, it wasn't going to let him leave. His phone buzzed one last time. Welcome to the dark. Max's scream echoed through the basement as the shadows closed in, and then silence. Sophie had always been fascinated by antiques. She loved the history and mystery they carried, as if each item had a story to tell. One afternoon, while wandering through a small, dusty antique shop on the outskirts of town, Sophie spotted something that immediately caught her eye: a porcelain doll, sitting on a high shelf, dressed in a tattered lace gown. Its glass eyes gleamed in the dim light, and its face was cracked in several places, giving it a slightly eerie appearance. The shopkeeper noticed Sophie's interest and approached her with a smile. That doll has been here for a long time. Some say it's cursed. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Cursed. The shopkeeper nodded. Strange things have happened to those who've owned it. But it's just an old story, something to scare the curious away. Sophie chuckled, intrigued. She had always loved good horror novels and scary stories to tell at sleepovers when she was younger. The idea of a haunted doll only added to its appeal. Without much thought, she bought it, ignoring the shopkeeper's warnings. After all, how scary could an old doll really be? That night, Sophie placed the doll on a shelf in her bedroom, its eyes facing the bed. She admired the craftsmanship of the doll's delicate features, despite its worn appearance. She felt a strange connection to it, like it had been waiting for her to find it. As she got into bed, she noticed that the doll's gaze seemed to follow her around the room, its lifeless eyes gleaming in the dim glow of her bedside lamp. A chill ran down her spine, but she shook off the feeling. It was just her imagination, fueled by the shopkeeper's ghost stories. But as she lay there in the dark, she couldn't shake the unsettling sensation that the doll was watching her. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, making her jump. She picked it up, expecting a late-night text from a friend, but instead she saw a message from an unknown number. "Do you like your new doll?" Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the message, her hands trembling slightly. Who could have known she had just bought the doll? She quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "She's watching you." A chill ran down her spine as she glanced over at the doll. Its glass eyes gleamed in the darkness, staring straight at her. Sophie felt a wave of unease wash over her. She grabbed the doll, quickly placing it in the closet, out of sight. But even with the door closed, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching her. Her phone buzzed again. You can't hide her. Sophie's hands shook as she typed back, "Who are you? Stop messing with me." There was a long pause before the reply came. She doesn't like to be ignored. Sophie's heart raced. She stood up, her pulse quickening as she approached the closet. She hesitated before opening the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When she swung it open, the doll was sitting there, its eyes fixed on her. Her phone buzzed again. "Let her out." Sophie stumbled back, her mind racing. How was this happening? It felt like one of those scary short stories to read online, where an innocent object turns into something far more sinister. She grabbed the doll, her hands shaking, and hurried to the living room, placing it on the couch. She needed to get rid of it. The shopkeeper's warning suddenly didn't seem so silly. As she stood there, trying to calm her nerves, her phone buzzed once more. She's angry. Sophie's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her eyes widening as she saw the doll. It wasn't sitting on the couch anymore. It had fallen or been moved onto the floor, its face turned toward her, its cracked smile looking more menacing now. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't normal. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the shopkeeper and demand an explanation. But before she could dial, her phone buzzed again. She wants to play. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled back, her hands trembling. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a sense of dread. The doll seemed to radiate a dark energy, its lifeless eyes gleaming in the dim light. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. The temperature dropped even further, and Sophie's breath fogged in front of her. She could feel the presence of something not of this world. Her phone buzzed one final time, and though she didn't want to look, she couldn't help herself. Let's play. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Sophie's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone's flashlight. When the beam of light cut through the darkness, she saw the doll, standing upright now, its cracked face staring directly at her, its smile wider, twisted. Her breath hitched as she backed away, her mind screaming for her to leave the house. But before she could move, the doll took a step forward. Sophie's scream echoed through the darkened room, but no one was there to hear it. If this story made you rethink buying old dolls, don't forget to hit like. Have you ever owned something that gave you the creeps? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you would do in Sophie's situation. And if you love scary stories to read online, make sure to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. You never know what might be waiting in the shadows. Sophie had always been fascinated by antiques. She loved the history and mystery they carried, as if each item had a story to tell. One afternoon, while wandering through a small, dusty antique shop on the outskirts of town, Sophie spotted something that immediately caught her eye: a porcelain doll, sitting on a high shelf, dressed in a tattered lace gown. Its glass eyes gleamed in the dim light, and its face was cracked in several places, giving it a slightly eerie appearance. The shopkeeper noticed Sophie's interest and approached her with a smile. "That doll has been here for a long time. Some say it's cursed." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Cursed?" The shopkeeper nodded. "Strange things have happened to those who've owned it, but it's just an old story, something to scare the curious away." Sophie chuckled, intrigued. She had always loved good horror novels and scary stories to tell at sleepovers when she was younger. The idea of a haunted doll only added to its appeal. Without much thought, she bought it, ignoring the shopkeeper's warnings. After all, how scary could an old doll really be? That night, Sophie placed the doll on a shelf in her bedroom, its eyes facing the bed. She admired the craftsmanship of the doll's delicate features, despite its worn appearance. She felt a strange connection to it, like it had been waiting for her to find it. As she got into bed, she noticed that the doll's gaze seemed to follow her around the room, its lifeless eyes gleaming in the dim glow of her bedside lamp. A chill ran down her spine, but she shook off the feeling. It was just her imagination, fueled by the shopkeeper's ghost stories. But as she lay there in the dark, she couldn't shake the unsettling sensation that the doll was watching her. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, making her jump. She picked it up, expecting a late-night text from a friend, but instead, she saw a message from an unknown number. "Do you like your new doll?" Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the message, her hands trembling slightly. Who could have known she had just bought the doll? She quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "She's watching you." A chill ran down her spine as she glanced over at the doll. Its glass eyes gleamed in the darkness, staring straight at her. Sophie felt a wave of unease wash over her. She grabbed the doll, quickly placing it in the closet, out of sight. But even with the door closed, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching her. Her phone buzzed again. "You can't hide her." Sophie's hands shook as she typed back, "Who are you? Stop messing with me." There was a long pause before the reply came. "She doesn't like to be ignored." Sophie's heart raced. She stood up, her pulse quickening as she approached the closet. She hesitated before opening the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When she swung it open, the doll was sitting there, its eyes fixed on her. Her phone buzzed again. "Let her out." Sophie stumbled back, her mind racing. How was this happening? It felt like one of those scary short stories to read online, where an innocent object turns into something far more sinister. She grabbed the doll, her hands shaking, and hurried to the living room, placing it on the couch. She needed to get rid of it. The shopkeeper's warning suddenly didn't seem so silly. As she stood there, trying to calm her nerves, her phone buzzed once more. "She's angry." Sophie's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her eyes widening as she saw the doll. It wasn't sitting on the couch anymore. It had fallen or been moved onto the floor, its face turned toward her, its cracked smile looking more menacing now. her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't normal. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the shopkeeper and demand an explanation. But before she could dial, her phone buzzed again. She wants to play. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled back, her hands trembling. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a sense of dread. The doll seemed to radiate a dark energy, its lifeless eyes gleaming in the dim light. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. The temperature dropped even further, and Sophie's breath fogged in front of her. She could feel the presence of something not of this world. Her phone buzzed one final time, and though she didn't want to look, she couldn't help herself. Let's play. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Sophie's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone's flashlight. When the beam of light cut through the darkness, she saw the doll, standing upright now, its cracked face staring directly at her, its smile wider, twisted. Her breath hitched as she backed away, her mind screaming for her to leave the house. But before she could move, the doll took a step forward. Sophie's scream echoed through the darkened room, but no one was there to hear it. If this story made you rethink buying old dolls, don't forget to hit like. Have you ever owned something that gave you the creeps? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you would do in Sophie's situation. And if you love scary stories to read online, make sure to subscribe for more spine-tingly. Tara sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by boxes of old photographs, each one like a window into a different time. Her family had lived in this house for decades, and every so often she enjoyed digging through these memories, trying to piece together their long, rich history. That evening, she was searching for a specific photo, one of her grandmothers standing in front of the old family farmhouse. But what she found was something else entirely. It was an image she had never seen before, faded and yellowed with age. The photo showed a group of people standing in front of an old barn, smiling brightly for the camera. But there was something off. The more Tara stared at it, the more a feeling of unease settled over her. There, standing just behind the group, was a figure faint, almost like a shadow. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer she looked, the clearer it became. A woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face partially obscured, stood at the edge of the frame. Her eyes, though barely visible, seemed to stare directly at Tara. It reminded her of those scary short stories to read online, where something unsettling always lurked in the background, just waiting to be noticed. Tara's heart skipped a beat. She had gone through these boxes countless times, but she had never seen this photo before, and she certainly didn't remember anyone mentioning a mysterious figure in the family albums. She flipped the photo over, hoping for some clue, but the back was blank. No date, no names, just a faint smudge of ink. The farmhouse in the picture was her grandparents' old place, the one she had visited as a child. It had long since been abandoned, left to decay in the woods after her grandparents passed. Tara hadn't been back in years, not since her parents sold the property. But now, staring at the photo, a chill ran down her spine. Who was that woman? She quickly packed up the boxes, her hands trembling slightly. But the image stayed with her, the mysterious figure burned into her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen the woman before, not just in the photograph, but somewhere else. Maybe in the stories her grandmother used to tell her as a child, tales that seemed harmless at the time, but now took on a darker tone. Later that night, after trying to distract herself with a movie, Tara found herself still thinking about the photo. It was like she had stepped into one of the scary stories to tell she had heard growing up, the kind where a single, strange discovery sets off a chain of terrifying events. Unable to resist, she grabbed her laptop and began searching for any information about the old farmhouse, hoping to find some history about the land or the people who lived there before her family. What she found was more unsettling than she had expected. The farmhouse had been built in the late 1800s, and the land had changed hands several times before her grandparents bought it. According to local folklore, the area was rumored to be haunted. Tara's heart pounded as she read accounts of strange sightings, ghostly figures seen near the barn, disembodied voices heard in the woods. One name kept coming up: Lily Carpenter. Lily had lived in the farmhouse long before Tara's family had owned it. She was a widow, known for her reclusive nature. Some said she practiced strange rituals in the woods. Others claimed she never left the house after her husband's sudden death. But what sent a shiver down Tara's spine was the story of Lily's disappearance. One day she had simply vanished, leaving behind only whispers of ghostly sightings around the property. Tara's mind raced. The figure in the photo, could it be Lily? Was this one of those good horror novels she loved reading, where the past never truly stayed buried? She had to know more. Without giving herself time to second-guess the decision, Tara grabbed her keys and headed out to the farmhouse. It was only an hour's drive away, but it felt like she was traveling to another world once steeped in mystery and fear. As she drove down the winding roads, the sky grew darker, the trees casting long shadows across the narrow path. The house came into view, its roof sagging, windows boarded up, and the barn just visible in the distance. The air was heavy with the weight of forgotten memories, and the silence was deafening. It was like stepping into one of those horror novels where the protagonist returns to the place that holds the answers to their darkest fears. Tara parked the car and hesitated, staring at the house. Every instinct told her to leave, to turn back and forget about the photo. But she couldn't. Not now. She approached the front door, which creaked loudly as she pushed it open. The inside of the house was cold, the musty smell of decay filling the air. Her footsteps echoed through the empty rooms as she made her way to the back, where the barn stood just beyond the overgrown fields. As she stepped outside, the wind picked up, rustling the tall grass. Tara's heart raced as she approached the barn, the same one from the photograph. She could almost feel the eyes of the woman in the picture watching her, waiting for her to uncover the truth. The barn door groaned as she pulled it open, the dark interior swallowing her whole. She clicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the dust and shadows. The inside of the barn was empty, save for a few old tools and broken furniture. But something in the far corner caught her eye, an old mirror, its glass cloudy with age. She stepped closer, her reflection distorted in the cracked surface. And then she saw her. The woman from the photograph. She stood behind Tara, her figure faint but unmistakable, her eyes locked onto Tara's through the reflection. Tara's breath hitched in her throat as she spun around, but the barn was empty. Her heart pounded in her ears as she turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the sudden sound making her jump. She pulled it out, her hands trembling as she read the message. "Do you see me now?" Tara's blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, her heart racing as her mind tried to make sense of what she had just seen. The photo, the figure in the mirror, was it real? Was Lily Carpenter still haunting the land, waiting for someone to notice her? The air grew colder, and Tara knew she couldn't stay any longer. She bolted out of the barn, the wind whipping through the trees as she ran back to her car. As she drove away, the farmhouse disappeared into the distance, but the image of the woman stayed with her, burned into her mind. And as she glanced in the rearview mirror, she swore she saw her again, standing at the edge of the road, watching. Late one night, Ethan sat at his desk, tapping away at his laptop in his dimly lit apartment. His office was his sanctuary, a small room cluttered with books, scattered notes, and the glowing hum of his computer screen. It was the perfect space to work on his passion project, a new novel, one inspired by the good horror novels he'd read over the years. But tonight, the creative process was slow, his thoughts wandering as the clock ticked past midnight. The apartment was unusually quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floor beneath his feet. Ethan had lived there for a few months now, and though he enjoyed the peace and quiet, something about the building always made him uneasy. The other tenants rarely spoke, the hallways were dim, and sometimes late at night he'd hear faint footsteps from the floor above. But there wasn't supposed to be anyone living up there. The landlord had told him the unit was vacant. Still, Ethan tried to brush off the eerie feelings, as his imagination running wild after all. He'd been spending hours diving into short horror stories to read online and scary stories to tell, so it was no wonder his mind was playing tricks on him. But as the night stretched on, that nagging sense of unease refused to leave. Around 2 a.m., just as Ethan was about to call it a night, something strange happened. The lights in his apartment flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. Ethan groaned, annoyed. The power had been unstable in the building before, but this outage felt different, more sudden, like the lights had been intentionally snuffed out. He fumbled around in the dark, reaching for his phone. The screen illuminated his face as he pulled up his flashlight, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. He got up and headed toward the hallway to check the fuse box, hoping it was just a minor issue. But as he stepped into the hallway, a chill ran down his spine. The hallway was completely dark, not a single light shining from the other apartments. And yet, it didn't feel empty. Ethan's footsteps echoed as he made his way toward the electrical panel, his pulse quickening with every step. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. It was the same sensation he'd read about in horror novels, the creeping dread, the sudden awareness that someone or something was watching. He reached the fuse box and opened it, squinting in the dim light from his phone. To his confusion, none of the breakers were tripped. The power should have been on. He flipped a few switches back and forth, but nothing happened. His apartment, and the entire floor, remained shrouded in darkness. As he turned to head back to his room, Ethan's phone buzzed in his hand. He paused, glancing down at the screen. A text message appeared from an unknown number. "Stay out of the dark." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the message, his mind racing. Who could have sent this? Was it a joke? He glanced around, half expecting someone to be lurking in the shadows, but the hallway was empty. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing through the dark, empty corridor. No answer. Just silence. He took a deep breath and tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone in the building was messing with him. But as he made his way back to his apartment, his phone buzzed again. "I see you." Ethan's blood ran cold. He whipped around, shining the light from his phone down the hallway. There was no one there, just the long stretch of darkness. His heart raced as he backed into his apartment, locking the door behind him. He had never believed in the supernatural, but tonight, it felt like something from one of those scary stories to read in the dark was unfolding in real life. His phone buzzed again, the glow of the screen casting an eerie light in the dark room. "Don't turn off the light." Ethan's hands shook as he held his phone, glancing around the room. But there was no light, just the faint glow of his phone screen. He tried to shake off the fear gripping him, but the messages felt too real, too personal. Suddenly, he heard a faint noise behind him, a soft creak, like the sound of someone shifting their weight. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat as he slowly turned around, his phone held out in front of him like a shield. The light from the screen flickered across the room, illuminating the shadows as they seemed to stretch toward him. There, in the corner of the room, something moved. His pulse raced as he pointed the light directly at the corner. For a moment, he saw nothing. But then, just as he was about to relax, a figure stepped forward, tall, dark, and faceless, like a shadow come to life. Ethan stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching him, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. He bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock as his hands shook. His phone buzzed one more time, the message burning into his mind. It's too late. The room grew colder, and Ethan could feel the figure's presence looming behind him. He forced the door open and ran into the hallway, his footsteps echoing through the empty building. His heart pounded as he made his way down the stairs, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the entire building was alive, feeding off his fear. As he burst through the front door of the apartment complex and into the cool night air, he didn't stop running until he reached the street. Panting, he glanced back at the building, half expecting to see the figure standing in one of the windows, watching him leave. But the windows were dark, and the building was silent. His phone buzzed again, and he hesitated before looking at the screen. A single message from the same unknown number appeared. "See you soon." The late evening sun cast a reddish hue over the highway as Julia drove home from her weekend getaway. The roads were mostly empty, with only a few cars speeding by in the opposite direction. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her thoughts wandering between the peaceful days she had spent in the countryside and the good horror novels she had devoured during her stay. The thought of curling up with another scary short story to read online when she got home made the long drive ahead feel a little less tedious. As the sky darkened and the stars began to peek through, Julia noticed something strange. In her rear-view mirror, the outline of a car appeared, its headlights off, but still close enough for her to see the silhouette. She frowned, adjusting the mirror to get a better look, but the vehicle was just a shadow in the distance. It wasn't uncommon for drivers to forget their headlights, but something about this car unsettled her. She sped up, hoping to put some distance between them, but the car stayed with her, keeping its distance but never falling too far behind. The situation reminded her of the scary stories to read in the dark that always left her wondering what might be lurking just out of sight. The road stretched endlessly before her, winding through the forest with no signs of civilization for miles. Julia tried to focus on the road, telling herself it was nothing, just another driver heading home. But the eerie feeling in her stomach wouldn't leave. Another glance in the rearview mirror made her heart skip a beat. The car was closer now. Still no headlights. Just the dark silhouette, trailing her, almost like a predator stalking its prey. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The darkness around her seemed to close in, and the familiar comfort of driving alone was replaced with a creeping sense of dread. Trying to shake off the feeling, Julia turned on the radio, hoping to distract herself with some music. But no matter what station she tuned into, all she could hear was static. The sound crackled through the speakers, adding to her growing sense of unease. It felt like the beginning of one of those slasher novels where the tension builds and builds and builds until it's too late. The car behind her suddenly accelerated, getting even closer. Panic surged through Julia as she pressed harder on the gas, her heart pounding in her chest. Why wasn't the driver passing her? Why had they been following her for so long? Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, startling her. She glanced down quickly, noticing a message from an unknown number. With trembling hands, she unlocked her phone and read the text. "Why are you speeding?" Julia's blood ran cold. She looked back at the road, her pulse racing. How could anyone know she was speeding? She checked the rearview mirror again. The car was still there, looming behind her like a shadow. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was the driver watching her? Had they somehow hacked into her phone? Or was this something far more sinister? The road ahead was still empty, stretching out into the dark forest. Julia pressed her foot down harder on the accelerator, desperate to put some distance between herself and the car. But no matter how fast she went, the car followed, matching her speed perfectly. The headlights remained off, the silhouette a constant presence in her rearview mirror. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "You can't outrun me." Julia's heart pounded in her chest as fear gripped her. This wasn't a prank. This was real. She was being followed. The road curved sharply ahead, and as she swerved around the bend, she made a decision. There was a rest stop a few miles up the road. She would pull over there, get out, and call for help. There had to be other drivers there. Someone would help her. She sped around the curve, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The rest stop came into view, a dimly lit parking lot with a few cars scattered around. Relief washed over her as she pulled in, her tires screeching slightly as she parked under a flickering streetlight. For a moment, she sat there, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white with fear. The car behind her slowed down but didn't stop. It passed by the rest stop, its dark silhouette fading into the night. Julia let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with adrenaline. Maybe she had imagined it all. Maybe it was just a coincidence. She grabbed her phone, ready to call someone, anyone, to talk about what had just happened. But before she could dial, her phone buzzed again. Nice try. Julia froze. Her heart raced as she looked around the parking lot. There were a few cars parked here, but none seemed out of place. She scanned the area, her pulse quickening. No one seemed to be watching her. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't stop herself. Check your back seat. Julia's blood turned to ice. Her hand hovered over the lock button, and she glanced at the rearview mirror. The back seat looked empty, but the darkness made it impossible to be sure. Her hands trembled as she turned around slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The back seat was empty, but the door was unlocked. A fresh wave of panic washed over her. Had someone been in the car with her the entire time? Was she alone now, or was this just part of the game? Julia's mind raced as she locked all the doors, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had to get out of here. She started the engine and peeled out of the rest stop, her heart pounding. As she sped down the highway, her phone buzzed again. She didn't look at it. She couldn't. All she could think about was getting home, getting away from whatever was following her. The highway seemed endless, the trees blurring past as her car roared down the road. But no matter how far she went, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still with her, that the stranger wasn't done yet. Her phone buzzed one final time, and despite every instinct telling her not to, she glanced at the screen. "I'll see you soon." Julia's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the darkness stretched out before her. She didn't know how, but she knew the stranger was right. On a crisp autumn evening, Ava stood in her bathroom, brushing her teeth in front of the mirror. The routine was comforting, a moment of normalcy at the end of a long day. She stared at her reflection, noting the fatigue in her eyes and the faint circles beneath them. She had been staying up late, binge reading good horror novels and scary short stories to read online, fascinated by the chills they sent down her spine. But tonight, something felt off. There was a strange energy in the air, a quiet tension she couldn't quite place. As she rinsed her mouth and wiped her face with a towel, Ava glanced at the mirror again, and her breath caught in her throat. Her reflection didn't move. It stood there, staring back at her, eyes locked onto hers, while she remained motionless. Panic surged through her as she dropped the towel, her heart pounding in her chest. She blinked, hoping it was just her tired mind playing tricks on her. But when she looked again, her reflection still hadn't moved. It was frozen in place, hands gripping the edge of the sink, eyes unblinking. Ava's pulse quickened, a familiar sense of dread creeping up her spine. It reminded her of the unsettling stories she'd read about mirrors, about reflections that weren't quite right, about scary stories to tell where things in mirrors took on a life of their own. But this was different. This wasn't fiction. This was happening right now. She stepped back, her hands trembling as she stared at the mirror. Her reflection stayed put, watching her with an intensity that made her feel like a trapped animal. It was like something out of a slasher novel, the kind where every movement felt dangerous, every choice had deadly consequences. "Is this real?" she whispered to herself, barely able to process what she was seeing. Suddenly, her reflection smiled. Ava gasped, stumbling backward, her heart racing. The smile was wrong too wide, too sinister, like a distorted version of her own expression. The reflection's eyes gleamed with something dark, something malicious. It felt like the reflection was alive, mocking her from the other side of the glass. With a shaky hand, she reached toward the mirror, hesitating just inches from the surface. Was this some kind of hallucination? Had she been reading too many short horror stories to read online, letting her imagination run wild? But as her fingers neared the glass, the reflection moved on its own, mirroring her movements exactly. The smile never wavered. Ava pulled her hand back, fear clawing at her chest. She had to get out of the bathroom, out of the apartment. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible, but there were no answers, just the overwhelming terror that something had taken her place in the mirror. She bolted for the door, flinging it open and rushing into the hallway. Her heart pounded in her ears as she ran toward the living room, desperate to put distance between herself and the mirror. But as she reached the doorway, something caught her eye. Another mirror, this one hanging above the fireplace. Her legs felt like lead as she forced herself to look, terrified of what she might see. The room reflected back at her, empty and still. She exhaled, relief flooding her body as she realized there was no twisted version of her lurking in this mirror. But then, the reflection moved. Ava's heart stopped as she watched her reflection step out from behind the hallway wall, entering the room. She hadn't moved an inch, yet there it was, her double, staring back at her from the mirror, mimicking the very fear she felt. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. She fumbled to pull it out, her hands shaking. A message from an unknown number flashed on the screen. Do you like what you see? Ava's blood ran cold. How was this happening? Who could have sent that message? She glanced around the room, the oppressive silence closing in on her. The reflection in the mirror smiled again, a grin that didn't belong to her. Another message buzzed through. I'm closer than you think. Ava backed away from the mirror, her pulse racing as the reflection stepped closer to the glass, as if trying to break through. The smile widened, and the reflection tilted its head, like a predator toying with its prey. Who are you? Ava whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection's eyes gleamed in response. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Ava's breath hitched as the silence thickened around her. In the darkness, she could feel the presence of her reflection, watching her, waiting. Her phone buzzed one more time. Turn around. Terror gripped her chest as she stood frozen in place. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to know what was standing behind her. But the pressure was overwhelming, the feeling of eyes boring into her back. Slowly, with shaking hands, Ava turned. There, just inches away from her, stood the reflection. It wasn't in the mirror anymore. Ava screamed, stumbling back as the reflection took a step forward, its smile stretching impossibly wide. The lights flickered back on for a brief second, revealing the twisted version of herself standing in the middle of the room, staring at her with empty eyes. Then, the lights went out again. Ava's scream echoed through the apartment, swallowed by the darkness. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to hit like. What would you do if your reflection didn't move with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about this terrifying twist. And if you enjoy scary stories to read online, be sure to subscribe for more creepy tales that will leave you questioning what's real and what's not. You won't want to miss what's coming next. It was past midnight when Connor heard the noises again. He had been trying to focus on his work, but the persistent sound from the basement kept pulling his attention away. At first, he thought it was just the creaky old house settling, but this was different. It was faint, like a whisper, a low, murmuring voice that seemed to rise up through the floorboards. Sitting in his study, Connor strained to listen, but the sound was too soft to make out clearly. He glanced over at the door leading to the basement, a creeping sense of dread washing over him. It reminded him of the good horror novels he loved reading, the ones where the protagonist starts to notice little things out of place, leading to something far worse. The house had always been quiet, almost too quiet, and ever since he'd moved in, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His friends had joked that it was haunted, feeding into his love for scary short stories to read online, but Connor had always shrugged it off. Ghosts weren't real, and old houses made noises. Simple as that. Or so he thought. Tonight, though, the sounds were different, persistent. It wasn't just random creaks or groans from the old pipes. It was almost like a conversation. He stood up, curiosity getting the better of him, and slowly made his way to the basement door. The air in the house felt heavier as he approached, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The basement had always made him uneasy. It was unfinished, cold, and damp, the kind of place where the walls seemed to absorb the darkness. But tonight there was something more, a palpable sense of fear. Connor hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He'd read enough scary stories to tell to know that this was the part where things usually took a turn for the worse. But this was real life. And real life wasn't like a slasher novel where the danger was always lurking just around the corner. Right? Taking a deep breath, he opened the door. The cool, musty air from the basement hit him as he flicked on the light. The single bulb at the top of the stairs cast long shadows over the concrete steps. Slowly, Connor descended, his heart pounding in his chest. The voices grew louder. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he paused, listening intently. It was clearer now, two voices, speaking in hushed tones, though the words were indistinguishable. Connor's pulse quickened as he scanned the basement, his eyes darting to every dark corner. But it was empty. There was no one there. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out, the glow of the screen illuminating his face in the dim light. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. Are you alone? Connor's breath caught in his throat. He glanced around the empty basement, the cold seeping into his bones. His fingers trembled as he typed a response. Who is this? The reply came almost instantly. You shouldn't have gone down there. Connor's heart pounded in his ears. He backed up toward the stairs, his eyes locked on the shadows that seemed to grow darker with each passing second. The air in the basement felt thick, suffocating, like something unseen was closing in on him. His phone buzzed again. They're watching you. A chill ran down his spine as he slowly turned, his gaze falling on the far corner of the basement. There, in the shadows, something moved. His breath caught as he stared into the darkness, the low murmur of voices growing louder, more insistent. He wanted to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. His phone buzzed again, and though he didn't want to look, he couldn't stop himself. Don't turn around. Connor's hands shook as he turned back toward the stairs. His instincts screamed at him to get out, to run, but he felt paralyzed. The voices were clearer now, though he still couldn't understand the words. It felt like a conversation happening just out of reach, like something from one of those scary stories to read in the dark, where the true horror wasn't what you saw but what you felt. Suddenly, the light above him flickered and went out, plunging the basement into complete darkness. Connor's heart raced as he fumbled for his phone, using the faint light from the screen to see. His hand brushed against the cold cement wall as he tried to find the stairs. His breath came in short, panic bursts as the voices surrounded him, whispering from every corner of the room. His phone buzzed one last time, and with trembling hands he glanced at the screen. They're behind you. Connor froze. Every instinct told him not to look, not to turn around, but the compulsion was too strong. Slowly he turned his head, the faint glow from his phone casting eerie shadows on the walls. There, standing at the bottom of the stairs, were two figures. They were barely visible in the dim light, their outlines faint and hazy. But Connor could see their faces pale, with empty eyes that stared straight at him. His heart pounded as he stumbled back, nearly dropping his phone. The figures didn't move, but their presence filled the room, oppressive and terrifying. Connor turned and bolted up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He didn't stop until he was back in the safety of his living room, slamming the basement door behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away, his eyes locked on the door. The voices had stopped. His phone buzzed again. You shouldn't have left. Connor's hands shook as he stared at the message, his mind racing. What had he just seen? Were they still down there, waiting for him to return? He glanced at the basement door, the feeling of dread still heavy in the air. He wasn't going back down there, not tonight, maybe not ever. If this story made you think twice about your basement, don't forget to like this video. Have you ever heard something you couldn't explain? Tell me in the comments, I'd love to hear your stories. And if you're a fan of scary stories to read online, make sure to subscribe for more eerie tales. There's always something waiting in the dark, ... Leah had always hated the attic. Growing up, she avoided it at all costs, its dusty corners and dark shadows fueling her childhood imagination. Even as an adult, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that clung to the place. But when her parents passed away and left her the family home, it became her responsibility to clean it out. One rainy afternoon, Leah found herself standing at the bottom of the attic stairs, staring up at the darkened space. The flashlight in her hand flickered slightly as she took a deep breath and climbed the creaky wooden steps. The attic was exactly as she remembered it, cobwebbed and cluttered, filled with old boxes, forgotten memories, and the strange sense that she wasn't alone. The room was thick with dust, the air stale and heavy. Leah's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating old furniture, picture frames, and family heirlooms. She had come to clean things out, but now, standing here, all she could think about were the scary short stories to read online she'd been obsessed with lately. Those stories always had attics dark, forgotten places where things that shouldn't exist lurked in the shadows. As she rummaged through the boxes, Leah stumbled upon something unexpected, an old porcelain doll, tucked away in the corner of the attic, its lifeless eyes staring up at her. The doll was dressed in an antique lace gown, its face cracked in several places. A shiver ran down Leah's spine as she stared at it. She didn't remember ever owning a doll like this. She picked it up carefully, the porcelain cold and unsettling to the touch. The doll's expression was blank, but its eyes seemed to follow her as she moved around the room. It reminded her of the scary stories to tell she'd read growing up, the kind where cursed objects always carried a dark history with them. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered again, casting long, strange shadows across the attic. Leah felt a chill creep up her arms, and for a moment, she thought she heard something, a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, the doll still clutched in her hands. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling in the empty attic. There was no reply, just silence. Leah shook her head, trying to calm her nerves. It was an old house, of course it would make noises. She was just letting her imagination get the better of her. She had been reading too many good horror novels, and now her mind was playing tricks. But the doll felt heavy in her hands, too real, too cold. She placed it back in the corner and quickly moved to another box, hoping to distract herself from the growing sense of unease. But as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was watching her. An hour later, Leah had barely made a dent in the clutter. The rain outside had intensified, the sound of it pounding against the roof. She decided to take a break, heading downstairs to make herself some tea. But as she left the attic, she glanced back at the doll one more time, its cracked face barely visible in the fading light. Something about it seemed wrong, like it was waiting for her to leave. In the kitchen, the warmth of the tea calmed her nerves. She sat by the window, watching the rain fall in sheets, the sound oddly soothing. Maybe she had imagined it all. Maybe the attic was just as creepy as she remembered, and her mind had filled in the rest. But then her phone buzzed. Leah glanced down, expecting a message from a friend, but her stomach dropped when she saw the text. "Why did you leave me?" The number was unknown. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the message, her mind racing. Who could have sent this? No one knew she was at the house, and even if they did, who would send such a message? Her fingers trembled as she typed back. "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "Come back." Leah's pulse quickened as dread settled over her. She stood up from the table, her eyes drifting toward the door that led back upstairs. Every part of her wanted to ignore the text, to leave the attic alone, but she couldn't. Something was drawing her back. Against her better judgment, Leah climbed the stairs again, her hand shaking as she reached for the attic door. It creaked open, revealing the dim, cluttered room once more. The air felt colder than before, the shadows longer and more menacing. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The doll was gone. Leah's breath caught in her throat as her flashlight swept the room, searching for the porcelain figure. But it was nowhere to be seen. She had left it right there. In the corner, she was sure of it. Her phone buzzed again, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. "I'm waiting." Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned, her flashlight shaking in her hand. There, at the top of the stairs, the doll sat, its cracked face turned toward her, its blank eyes gleaming in the dim light. Leah stumbled backward, her pulse racing. She didn't know how the doll had moved, but she wasn't going to wait to find out. She turned and ran down the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps, as she bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind her. In the safety of the hallway, she leaned against the wall, her breath coming in short, panic bursts. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed a friend. The phone rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. Her phone buzzed again. "Don't leave me." Leah's blood ran cold. She turned and looked at the attic door, her heart pounding in her ears. She wasn't going back up there. Not ever. She didn't care what was up there, but whatever it wasn't staying with her. She grabbed her keys and rushed out of the house, the rain soaking her as she sprinted to her car. As she drove away, the house disappeared into the storm, but the image of the doll stayed with her, those lifeless eyes, watching her, waiting. It was a crisp autumn morning when Megan stumbled upon the small, antique shop hidden in the back streets of her town. She had been out for a walk, enjoying the quiet, when something about the shop caught her eye. The storefront was old, with dusty windows and a sign so faded that she could barely make out the name. Intrigued, Megan decided to step inside, her curiosity piqued. The shop was cluttered with items from another time old furniture, tarnished silverware, and shelves filled with trinkets that looked like they had seen better days. The air smelled faintly of dust and old books. As Megan wandered through the narrow aisles, she couldn't help but feel a chill. There was something about the place that reminded her of the good horror novels she often read, where forgotten objects hid dark secrets. Then she saw it. Tucked away on a shelf, behind a stack of cracked teacups, was a delicate necklace. It was silver, with a small, ornate pendant in the shape of an eye. The craftsmanship was beautiful, but there was something about it that felt off. The way the eye seemed to stare back at her, following her every move, sent a shiver down her spine. It reminded her of the cursed objects she had read about in scary stories to read in the dark. Still, Megan was drawn to it. She picked it up carefully, the cool metal sending a chill through her fingers. As she held the necklace, the shopkeeper, a frail, elderly woman, appeared behind her, moving silently across the room. "That's a special piece," the woman said, her voice low and raspy. Megan smiled politely, but there was something unsettling about the woman's tone. "How much for the necklace?" she asked, running her fingers along the intricate design. The woman stared at Megan for a moment, her pale eyes narrowing. "It's not for sale." Megan blinked, confused. "But it's just sitting here on the shelf." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "Some things are better left where they are," she said cryptically, before turning and disappearing into the back of the shop. Megan glanced down at the necklace again, her curiosity growing. She should have listened to the woman's warning, but something about the necklace called to her. Before she knew what she was doing, she slipped it into her pocket and quickly left the shop, the faint jingle of the bell above the door, the only sound behind her. That night, Megan couldn't stop thinking about the necklace. She sat on her bed, the pendant resting in her palm. The eye in the center seemed to gleam in the dim light of her room, almost like it was watching her. Despite the unease it caused, she found herself slipping it around her neck. As the cool metal touched her skin, a strange sensation washed over her, a mix of dread and curiosity, as though she had stepped into one of those short horror stories to read online, where the consequences of a single choice unfold with terrifying clarity. For the next few days, strange things began happening. It started small items in her apartment would be moved, though Megan was certain she hadn't touched them. Lights flickered whenever she entered a room, and the air around her felt colder, heavier. She brushed it off as coincidence, but deep down she knew something was wrong. The necklace grew warmer each day, as if it was alive, pulsing gently against her skin. Megan tried to take it off, but the clasp wouldn't budge. Panic started to settle in. No matter how hard she tugged, the necklace stayed in place, as if it had fused with her skin. One night, she woke suddenly to the feeling of someone watching her. Her room was bathed in shadows, and the necklace felt hot, almost burning. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and that's when she saw a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed, its face obscured by the shadows. Megan's breath caught in her throat as the figure moved closer. The air grew colder, and she could feel a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The figure's hand reached out, long and thin, and touched the pendant around her neck. "You shouldn't have taken it," a voice whispered, cold and hollow. Megan screamed, throwing herself out of bed, her hands clawing at the necklace. But it wouldn't come off. The figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a suffocating silence. She stumbled toward the mirror, her fingers desperately trying to remove the necklace, but it stayed locked in place, the eyes staring back at her with a sinister glint. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, and Megan grabbed it with shaking hands. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "You can't escape it." Her heart pounded as she stared at the text. The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick with fear. Megan grabbed her keys and rushed out of the apartment, not caring that it was the middle of the night. She needed to get away. She found herself back at the antique shop, the bell above the door ringing as she burst inside. The shop was dark, empty, the shelves filled with the same dusty trinkets. But the shopkeeper was nowhere to be seen. "Please," Megan called out, her voice trembling. "I need help." The silence in the shop was deafening. She wandered through the aisles, her heart racing, her hands still tugging at the necklace. The old woman was gone, but Megan could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her, just like in the scary campfire stories she had grown up hearing where cursed objects always came with a terrible price. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen, her stomach twisting in fear. It's too late. Megan turned toward the back of the shop, and there, standing in the shadows, was the shopkeeper. The old woman's pale eyes gleamed as she stepped forward. "You should never have taken it," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "The curse is yours now." Megan's breath caught in her throat as the woman reached out, her cold fingers brushing against the pendant. The necklace grew hotter, searing Megan's skin, but she couldn't move, frozen in place by the weight of the curse. "You belong to it now," the shopkeeper said, her voice soft and full of finality. And then the lights in the shop flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Carter had lived in his new house for a few months before he discovered the hidden door. The house was old over a century, by his best guess, and full of creaky floorboards and narrow hallways that reminded him of the good horror novels he used to read. The attic was the last place he'd gotten around to exploring, but after hearing strange noises in the night, he decided to check it out. One cold Saturday afternoon, Carter pulled down the rickety attic stairs and climbed up into the dusty space. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Old furniture and trunks filled the room, their shapes hidden under yellowed sheets. As he explored, his flashlight flickered over an odd section of the wall in the far corner. The paneling didn't match the rest of the room. Curious, he ran his hand over the surface, and to his surprise, it moved. A door. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't on the house's blueprint. There was no mention of a secret room. It reminded him of one of those scary short stories to read online, where a hidden door leads to something terrible, something that should have stayed hidden. Carter hesitated before opening it. The air felt heavier now, like something was waiting behind that door. He almost turned back but couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. His fingers fumbled with the latch, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage leading into darkness. A chill ran down his spine as he stepped inside, the musty air thick with dust. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows along the narrow corridor. At the end of the passage was a small room, barely bigger than a closet. The walls were lined with old wallpaper, faded and peeling, and the only thing inside was a single wooden chair in the center of the room. Carter's breath caught in his throat as he stepped inside. The room felt wrong, like it didn't belong. The air was colder here, the silence almost deafening. He shone his flashlight over the walls, searching for any clue as to why the room had been hidden away. But there was nothing, just the chair, sitting there like a forgotten memory. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from an unknown number. "Why did you open it?" Carter's blood ran cold. He spun around, shining his flashlight back toward the door, but the attic was empty. The passageway loomed behind him, dark and silent. He swallowed hard, trying to calm his racing heart. This had to be a prank. Someone was messing with him. He typed a quick reply, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "You shouldn't be here." Carter's pulse quickened. He backed out of the room, his flashlight flickering as he made his way down the narrow passage. His mind raced, filled with the eerie tales from scary campfire stories he'd heard as a kid about people who opened doors that should have stayed locked, only to unleash something they couldn't escape. As he reached the attic, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. Carter jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. He rushed toward the attic stairs, but before he could leave, his phone buzzed again. "Stay." Carter froze, his hand on the railing. The attic felt darker now, the air colder. He turned back to the hidden door, half expecting it to swing open again, but it stayed shut. His mind raced with possibilities. Was someone inside the house with him? Had someone been living in that room? Or was it something worse? The old stories about haunted houses came rushing back, scary stories to read in the dark where forgotten rooms held more than just old furniture. He had always laughed them off, but now, standing alone in the attic, he wasn't so sure. His phone buzzed again, the screen casting an eerie glow in the dim attic. "Look behind you." Carter's blood ran cold. Every instinct told him not to turn around, not to look. But the pull was too strong. Slowly he turned his head, his flashlight shaking in his hand. There, standing at the far end of the attic, was a figure. It was barely visible in the shadows, but Carter could see enough to make his heart stop. The figure was tall, its outline faint and hazy, but its eyes were glowing, staring at him from across the room. Carter stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. His hands shook as he fumbled for the attic stairs, his mind screaming at him to run. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. His phone buzzed one last time. He should never have opened the door. That was all the encouragement Carter needed. He turned and bolted down the attic stairs, slamming the hatch shut behind him. His heart raced as he locked the door, leaning against the wall as his breath came in short, panic bursts. He wasn't going back up there. Whatever was in that room, whatever he had disturbed, it wasn't leaving him alone. The house felt different now, as if the darkness from the attic had seeped into every corner. His phone buzzed again, and though every part of him didn't want to look, he forced himself to check the screen. "I'm still here." Carter's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the message, his hands trembling. He glanced toward the attic door, the sense of dread growing with each passing second. He wasn't alone, not anymore. It had been a long week, and all Ava wanted was a quiet evening at home. She loved her apartment nestled in the heart of the city, with large windows that overlooked the quiet street below. The soft hum of cars and the glow of streetlights gave her a sense of comfort. It was the perfect place to unwind with a good book. Tonight, she had planned to start one of the good horror novels she'd recently picked up, the kind that sent chills down her spine, keeping her awake long into the night. As she settled into her couch, blanket wrapped around her, Ava opened her book. The night outside was still, and the only sound in the apartment was the rustling of pages. But as she read, her attention kept drifting to the window. It wasn't like her to feel uneasy, but something about the night felt off, as if the silence was too perfect. She shrugged it off, telling herself she had been reading too many scary short stories to read online lately. The mind had a way of playing tricks when it was filled with dark thoughts. But as the night wore on, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Every now and then, Ava would glance up from her book, her eyes drawn to the window, expecting to see something or someone there. It wasn't until she heard the soft tap on the glass that her heart truly skipped a beat. Ava froze, her breath catching in her throat. The tap came again, soft but insistent, like a faint knock. Slowly, she turned her head, eyes locked on the window. Nothing, just the empty street and the dim glow of the streetlights. She laughed nervously to herself. It had to be the wind, she thought. Or maybe a tree branch brushing against the glass. But deep down, she knew that wasn't it. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the window. She grabbed it, expecting a text from a friend, but what she saw made her stomach twist. "Look outside." The message was from an unknown number. Ava's heart raced as she stared at the screen. Her hands trembled as she typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "I'm outside your window." Ava's blood ran cold. Her eyes darted to the window, but there was no one there. Just the empty street, the quiet night. She stood up from the couch, her body tense as she slowly approached the glass. Every step felt heavier, the silence of the apartment now suffocating. She peered outside, her breath fogging up the glass, but the street was empty. Relief washed over her, and she exhaled, laughing at her own paranoia. She had been reading too many scary stories to tell the kind where the protagonist always saw things that weren't there. But just as she turned to walk away, she saw it. A face. It was faint, just barely visible in the reflection of the window, but it was there staring at her from the street below. Ava's heart stopped. The face was pale, its eyes wide and unblinking. She whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the street was empty. The face was gone. Her phone buzzed again. "Did you see me?" Ava's hands shook as she typed back, her breath coming in short gasps. "Who are you?" The reply was immediate. "I'm watching you." Panic surged through her as she backed away from the window, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the police, but before she could dial, another message appeared. "Don't bother. I'm closer than you think." Ava's blood ran cold. Her eyes darted around the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Was someone in the apartment? How had they seen her from the street? She raced to the front door, checking the locks. Everything was secure, but it didn't matter. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. Her phone buzzed again. "I'm inside." Ava's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back from the door, her mind screaming at her to leave, to get out. But her legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. She glanced at the window again, her heart pounding in her ears. And then she saw it. The face was in the window again, but this time it was clearer, closer. It wasn't outside, it was inside, staring at her from just beyond the glass. Ava's scream echoed through the apartment as she turned and bolted toward the hallway. Her hands fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. The lights stayed off, the darkness swallowing her whole. She could feel it now, someone watching her, someone standing just out of sight. Her phone buzzed one last time. "Look behind you." Ava froze, her heart racing. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to know what was there, but the pull was too strong. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes wide with fear. There, standing in the darkness behind her, was the figure. The same pale face, the same wide, unblinking eyes. It stood motionless, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Ava's breath hitched in her throat as she backed away, her hands trembling. But no matter how far she moved, the figure stayed where it was, its eyes locked onto hers. And then, without warning, it smiled. It had been years since Emma had returned to her grandparents' old house, deep in the countryside. The place had been left abandoned after their passing, sitting untouched, a forgotten relic of her childhood. The house was large and creaky, with dark wood paneling and tall windows that seemed to watch the fields outside. Emma had always been curious about the house's history, but there was one room that had remained locked for as long as she could remember. Her grandparents had always warned her not to go near at the door at the end of the second-floor hallway. "That room stays closed," they'd say, and she had never dared to ask why. But now, with no one left to tell her otherwise, Emma was determined to find out what was behind the door. The house groaned under the weight of the wind as Emma explored the upstairs, her flashlight casting long shadows on the old wallpaper. The place had been left exactly as it was when her grandparents lived there, furniture draped in sheets, dust thick on every surface. It reminded her of the eerie good horror novels she loved, the ones that made her heart race with each turn of the page. She made her way to the end of the hallway, her breath catching in her throat as she stood before the door. It was just as she remembered, old, painted white, and strangely out of place compared to the rest of the house. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the brass doorknob. What could be behind it? Her imagination had run wild over the years, fueled by the scary stories to read in the dark she devoured. Taking a deep breath, Emma turned the knob. To her surprise, the door opened easily, the hinges creaking loudly as it swung inward. The room beyond was dark, and a rush of cold air sent a shiver down her spine. She stepped inside, her flashlight illuminating the space. The room was empty, no furniture, no decorations, just a small window at the far end, covered in dust. But something about it felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with an unsettling energy. It was as if the room had been waiting for her. As she shone her flashlight around, something on the floor caught her eye. There, in the middle of the room, was a single object, a key, old and tarnished, lying in the dust. Emma's pulse quickened as she bent down to pick it up. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emma jumped, her heart racing as she spun around. The door was closed, and the room had grown even colder. She rushed to the door, her hands fumbling with the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her as she pulled harder, but it was no use. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "You shouldn't have opened it." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the message, her mind racing. Who could have sent this? Was someone watching her? She backed away from the door, her flashlight flickering in the dim light. Another buzz.